James Carter stepped off the city bus, his heart pounding with excitement. It was his first day at the Grand Horizon Hotel, and he could hardly believe he had landed this job. The hotel was one of the most famous in the city, a place where business leaders, celebrities, and tourists stayed. Working here was a big opportunity for him. It was his chance to start fresh, prove himself, and build a good future. He adjusted his tie and smoothed down his neatly pressed shirt. He had spent extra time getting ready that morning, making sure he looked professional. His shoes were polished, his hair neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with confidence. He wanted to make a good first impression on his new boss and coworkers. As he walked toward the hotel entrance, he took in the sight of the grand building. The glass doors gleamed under the bright morning sun, and the golden logo of the hotel shone proudly above them. Guests were arriving, some stepping out of expensive cars, while bellhops rushed forward to help with their luggage. It was a busy, lively place, and James felt a thrill of excitement. But just as he was about to step inside, he noticed two hotel staff members. One was a security guard, and the other was a middle-aged man in a suit who looked like a manager. They were standing near the entrance, watching him closely. At first, James didn't think much of it. After all, he was just another employee walking in for his shift. But as he got closer, he noticed their expressions change. They frowned, and their eyes filled with suspicion. James barely had time to react before the security guard stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his tone firm. "Can I help you?" James blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, I'm James Carter. I'm starting my new job here today as a receptionist." He smiled politely, reaching into his pocket to pull out his phone and show his confirmation email. But before he could do so, the man in the suit crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes. "You're not allowed to be here. Guests only." James felt a sudden wave of confusion. He looked down at his outfit, clean, professional, and appropriate for work. He didn't understand why they were treating him this way. He tried again, keeping his voice calm. "I'm an employee. I have a job here. If you check with Mr. Langston, the general manager, he'll confirm it." The security guard exchanged a glance with the manager, but neither of them looked convinced. Instead of checking James's claim, they stepped closer, their body language unfriendly. "I think you should leave," the manager said, his voice sharp. "This is a private property." James felt heat rise in his chest. This wasn't right. He wasn't causing trouble. He was here to work, just like everyone else. But no matter what he said, they weren't listening. A small crowd had started to gather nearby, watching the scene unfold. Some guests looked curious, others uncomfortable. James felt humiliation creep in, but he refused to make a scene. He took a deep breath and tried one last time. "Please, just call Mr. Langston. He's expecting me." But the manager shook his head. "I don't have time for this." He turned to the security guard. "Escort him out." James barely had time to protest before the security guard grabbed his arm and steered him toward the sidewalk. His heart pounded as he found himself standing outside, looking back at the grand hotel doors that had just been slammed shut in his face. For a moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what had happened. He felt a mix of anger, frustration, and disappointment. He had worked so hard to get this job, and within minutes of arriving, he had been thrown out like he didn't belong. But James wasn't the type to give up easily. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He took out his phone, scrolled to the number Mr. Langston had given him, and hit call. This wasn't over. James stood outside the Grand Horizon Hotel, his phone pressed against his ear. His hands were steady, but inside, his emotions were all over the place. He wasn't angry. No, anger wouldn't help him right now. He was just disappointed. He had worked hard to get this job, and now, just because of someone's assumption, he had been kicked out like a stranger who didn't belong. The phone rang twice before a deep, confident voice answered. "Mr. Langston speaking." James took a deep breath, making sure his voice remained calm. "Good morning, sir. This is James Carter. I just arrived at the hotel for my first day, but there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Mr. Langston asked, his tone shifting. "What happened?" James hesitated for only a moment before explaining. "I was stopped at the entrance. The security guard and a manager didn't believe I worked here. I tried to explain, but they wouldn't listen. They escorted me out before I could even show my confirmation email." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then Mr. Langston spoke, and this time his voice was sharp. "Stay where you are, James. I'm coming right now." James lowered the phone, exhaling slowly. The people who had watched him get kicked out were still around. Some were hotel guests, others were passers-by. He saw a woman whisper something to her husband while glancing in his direction. A few feet away, the security guard who had removed him stood by the entrance, arms crossed, looking satisfied with his decision. James could have walked away. He could have just left and tried to find another job somewhere else. But he refused. He had earned this position. He had gone through the interview, passed the requirements, and been chosen for the role. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He was here to work. Minutes later, the hotel doors swung open, and out walked Mr. Langston. He was a tall man in his 50s, dressed in a dark blue suit with a golden name tag pinned to his chest. His face was serious as he scanned the area until his eyes landed on James. "James," he said, walking toward him with purpose. "Are you all right?" "Yes, sir," James replied, standing straight. Mr. Langston nodded before turning sharply toward the security guard and the manager, who were now watching with nervous expressions. The guard shifted on his feet, while the manager's confidence seemed to disappear. "Is this the man you removed from the hotel?" Mr. Langston demanded, his voice firm. The manager cleared his throat. Well, sir, There was some confusion. Mr. Langston didn't let him finish. "James Carter is our new receptionist. Today is his first day. You removed one of our employees from the building without verifying anything." The security guard glanced at the manager as if waiting for him to say something, but the manager remained silent, looking guilty. James said nothing, letting Mr. Langston handle the situation. He had done his part. He had spoken with respect, followed the rules, and still been treated unfairly. Now it was time for them to realize their mistake. "Unbelievable," Mr. Langston muttered. Then he looked at James again. "Come with me." James followed Mr. Langston past the same security guard and manager who had denied him entry. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The front lobby was grand, with shining marble floors, elegant chandeliers, and a front desk that stretched across the room. Guests moved in and out, carrying luggage, talking, and enjoying their stay. James had imagined this moment differently. He had thought his first time walking in would be filled with excitement, but instead there was a quiet understanding. Things weren't always fair, but he wouldn't let that stop him. As he approached the reception area, other employees turned to look. Some whispered to each other, probably wondering why the general manager was personally escorting him in. Mr. Langston stopped in front of the desk, placed a hand on James's shoulder, and turned to the staff. His voice was loud and clear. "Everyone, meet James Carter, our new receptionist." The room fell silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the staff nodded and murmured greetings. A few smiled, but others looked uncertain. It didn't matter. James was here now, and he wasn't going anywhere. This was only the beginning. James stood behind the reception desk, his hands resting lightly on the smooth surface. The front lobby of the Grand Horizon Hotel was as beautiful as he had imagined. Polished floors, golden chandeliers, and elegant decorations. Guests walked in and out, chatting, carrying their luggage, and enjoying their stay. It was a place full of life, and now it was his workplace. But despite finally being inside, James could feel the weight of what had happened earlier. He had been thrown out before even starting his job. And now, the same people who had watched him being escorted out were seeing him standing here, ready to work. He noticed some employees whispering among themselves, their eyes flickering toward him, but he ignored it. He wasn't here to impress them. He was here to do his job. Mr. Langston, the general manager, stood beside him, giving instructions. James, I'll have one of our senior receptionists show you how things work, but I have no doubt you'll do great here. James nodded. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. The manager from earlier, the one who had helped remove him from the entrance, stood nearby. His face was stiff, his arms crossed. He hadn't said anything since Mr. Langston had introduced James to everyone. It was clear that he felt uncomfortable, maybe even embarrassed. But James didn't pay him much attention. A woman in a navy blue uniform stepped forward. She looked to be in her late 30s, with short black hair and a warm smile. Hi, I'm Linda. I'll be showing you around and helping you get started. James smiled back. Nice to meet you, Linda. She handed him a name tag, which had his name printed in bold letters. Here, wear this. It makes things official. James took it and pinned it onto his shirt. As he did, he felt a sense of pride. He belonged here, no matter what had happened earlier. Linda guided him through the reception area, explaining how the hotel's booking system worked. She showed him how to check guests in, answer calls, and handle special requests. James listened carefully, making sure to remember every detail. After about an hour of training, Linda turned to him. All right, I think you're ready to take your first check-in. She nodded toward a man and his wife who had just approached the desk. Go ahead. James took a deep breath, stepped forward, and gave his best professional smile. Welcome to the Grand Horizon Hotel. How may I assist you today? The man smiled back. We have a reservation under the name Patterson. James quickly typed the name into the computer. His fingers moved smoothly across the keyboard as he followed the steps Linda had shown him. Within seconds, the reservation details popped up on the screen. Yes, Mr. Patterson, I see your booking here. You'll be staying in our deluxe suite for 3 nights. Let me get your room key. He printed out the key card, handed it over, and gave them directions to their room. If there's anything you need during your stay, please don't hesitate to call the front desk. Mr. Patterson took the key card and nodded. That was fast. Great service, young man. James felt a wave of satisfaction. Thank you, sir. Enjoy your stay. As the couple walked away, Linda clapped her hands lightly. See, you're a natural. James chuckled. Well, I had a great teacher. For the next few hours, James continued working, checking in guests and answering calls. He was focused, professional, and efficient. Slowly, he felt more comfortable in his new role. He could still feel some employees watching him, but now there was a hint of respect in their eyes. The security guard from earlier walked past the reception desk. He glanced at James, hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod before continuing on his way. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. As James finished helping another guest, he glanced around the hotel lobby. He was finally where he belonged. James had been working at the reception desk for a few hours now, and things were finally starting to feel normal. He had already checked in several guests, answered phone calls, and handled a few special requests. Everything was running smoothly, just the way he had hoped. But he could still feel the weight of what had happened earlier. The memory of being stopped at the entrance and kicked out of the hotel wasn't something he could easily forget. Every now and then, he caught glimpses of the security guard and the manager who had confronted him. They didn't say anything, but he could feel their eyes on him. James wasn't someone who held grudges, but he believed in fairness. He had done nothing wrong that morning, yet he had been treated like an outsider. Still, he wasn't going to let that moment define him. He was here to do his job, and he would do it well. Linda, the senior receptionist who had been training him, smiled as she handed him a stack of check-in forms. You're doing great, James. Honestly, I've trained a lot of new employees, but you're one of the fastest learners I've seen." James smiled. "Thanks, Linda. I just want to do a good job." She nodded. "And you are. Just keep this up, and soon everyone will see that you belong here." Just then, a guest approached the front desk. He was an older man, dressed in a fine suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His expression was serious, and James could tell he was the type of guest who expected everything to be perfect. James straightened his posture and greeted him with a warm smile. "Good afternoon, sir. Welcome to the Grand Horizon Hotel. How may I assist you today?" The man adjusted his glasses and spoke in a firm voice. "I have a reservation under the name Mr. Wilkins." James quickly typed the name into the system and found the booking details. "Yes, Mr. Wilkins, I see your reservation here. You'll be staying in our executive suite for 2 nights. Let me get your room key." As James prepared the key card, Mr. Wilkins suddenly frowned and glanced at his name tag. "James Carter?" he asked. James looked up. "Yes, sir." Mr. Wilkins studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Carter. I remember that name. A few years ago, I worked with a man named Richard Carter. He was one of the best employees I ever had. Any relation?" James felt a warmth in his chest. "Yes, sir. Richard Carter was my father." Mr. Wilkins' expression softened. "Well, that explains a lot. Your father was a hard-working, honest man. If you're anything like him, this hotel is lucky to have you." James felt a surge of pride. His father had passed away a few years ago, but hearing someone speak so highly of him made him feel closer to him again. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Mr. Wilkins nodded. "Keep up the good work, young man." He took the key card and headed toward the elevator. Linda, who had been listening, smiled. "That was a nice moment." James nodded. "Yeah, it was." Just then, Mr. Langston, the general manager, walked over. He looked serious as he turned to the staff. "I need all employees to gather in the main hall in 10 minutes. There's something important we need to discuss." James exchanged a glance with Linda. "A meeting? What was it about?" As the employees began to gather, James noticed that the security guard and the manager who had kicked him out were also standing nearby. Their faces looked tense, as if they knew something was coming. James followed the rest of the hotel staff into the main hall, where meetings were usually held. It was a large room with rows of chairs neatly arranged, a stage at the front, and a big screen mounted on the wall. Employees whispered among themselves, wondering what the meeting was about. Mr. Langston, the general manager, stood near the front, his expression serious. Next to him stood a few senior staff members, including Linda, the friendly receptionist who had been helping James, and the hotel's assistant manager. James noticed that the security guard and the manager who had kicked him out earlier were sitting near the back. They looked tense, as if they knew something was coming. Once everyone was seated, Mr. Langston cleared his throat and spoke. "I've called this meeting because I need to address something important. This morning, an incident occurred at the entrance of this hotel, an incident that should never have happened." The room fell silent. James could feel the tension in the air. He didn't need to guess what this was about. Mr. Langston continued, his voice firm. "One of our new employees, James Carter, was prevented from entering the hotel. He was removed without any verification, even though he had every right to be here. The staff members involved in this action acted on assumption rather than fact, and that is unacceptable." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some employees looked surprised, while others nodded, as if they had expected this to be addressed. James sat still, listening carefully. He hadn't expected Mr. Langston to speak about this in front of everyone, but he was glad the issue was being acknowledged. Mr. Langston's sharp eyes moved across the room. "This hotel stands for professionalism, respect, and fairness. We treat our guests with the highest level of service, and we should treat our employees with the same level of dignity. No one should feel unwelcome in their own workplace." He paused, then turned his attention toward the security guard and the manager responsible for the incident. I have spoken to the individuals involved. They have been reminded of our policies and the importance of treating all employees and guests with respect. I trust that this will not happen again. The security guard looked down, avoiding eye contact. The manager gave a stiff nod, but said nothing. James didn't feel the need to look at them. He wasn't here for revenge. He just wanted to do his job without unnecessary trouble. Mr. Langston's voice softened slightly. James Carter is a valued member of our team, and I expect every employee to welcome him the same way we welcome every new hire. I also want to remind you all, before making assumptions, take a moment to ask questions, to verify, and to show kindness. That is the kind of workplace we should all strive for. James felt a quiet sense of relief. He hadn't needed an apology, but hearing the general manager stand up for him in front of everyone meant something. It showed that he wasn't alone in this. After a few more words about teamwork and professionalism, the meeting ended. Employees got up from their seats, some whispering to each other, others heading straight back to work. As James made his way toward the door, Linda patted his shoulder. "That was something, huh?" James nodded. "Yeah, I wasn't expecting all that." She smiled. "Well, you deserved to be recognized. And don't worry, people will start seeing you differently now." Just then, as James walked through the hallway back toward the reception desk, the security guard passed by him. He hesitated for a moment, then muttered, "Hey, I was wrong this morning. Sorry about that." James looked at him, studying his face. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was something. James gave a small nod. "All right." The security guard gave a short nod back and walked away. As James sat down at the front desk again, ready to continue his work, he felt lighter. He had faced a difficult situation, but he hadn't let it break him. He had stood his ground with dignity. And now things were slowly changing. This was just the beginning of his journey at the Grand Horizon Hotel, and he was ready for whatever came next. James sat at the reception desk, feeling more confident than ever. The meeting earlier had changed the atmosphere in the hotel. He could sense it. People who had been hesitant to interact with him before were now treating him like part of the team. Some even smiled and nodded when they passed by, a small but meaningful gesture. As the afternoon moved along, James stayed busy handling check-ins, answering calls, and assisting guests with their requests. Linda was right. People were seeing him differently now, not just as the new employee, but as someone who belonged here. While he was reviewing room availability on the computer, a guest approached the front desk. She was an elderly woman, dressed in a floral dress with a pearl necklace. She pulled her suitcase beside her and gave James a warm smile. "Good afternoon, young man," she said kindly. James smiled back. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to the Grand Horizon Hotel. How may I assist you today?" "I have a reservation under the name Mrs. Thornton," she said, adjusting the strap of her purse. James quickly found her details in the system. "Yes, Mrs. Thornton. You'll be staying with us for 4 nights in a deluxe suite. Let me prepare your key." As he worked, Mrs. Thornton looked at his name tag. "James Carter. That's a strong name. You seem like a hard-working young man." James chuckled. "I try my best, ma'am." She smiled. "That's all anyone can do." Just as James handed her the key card, another voice interrupted. "Excuse me. I need assistance immediately." James turned to see a man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp gray suit. He had an expensive watch on his wrist and a phone in his hand, typing rapidly. His expression was impatient, and his tone was sharp. James remained calm and professional. "Of course, sir. I'll be with you in just a moment." The man frowned. "I don't have time to wait. I booked the presidential suite, and I need to check in now." James glanced at Mrs. Thornton, who simply gave him an understanding nod. She didn't seem bothered by the interruption. James quickly located the man's reservation. "Mr. Caldwell, I see your booking here." Let me print your key card. But as James went through the process, the man tapped his fingers on the counter impatiently. This is taking too long. Isn't there someone more experienced who can handle this? James didn't let the comment get to him. He remained focused. I assure you, sir, I am handling your check-in as quickly as possible. Linda, who had been assisting another guest nearby, overheard the conversation. She walked over and stood beside James. Mr. Caldwell, James is one of our best receptionists. I assure you, he is fully capable of assisting you. The man scoffed but didn't argue further. He snatched the key card as soon as James handed it to him. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked away. Mrs. Thornton shook her head. Some people forget that kindness doesn't cost anything. James let out a small laugh. That's true, ma'am. Linda patted James on the back. You handled that well. Some guests can be difficult, but staying calm is the key. James nodded. I get it. Some people are just in a hurry, but I won't let it ruin my day. Mrs. Thornton smiled. You have the right attitude, young man. Keep up the good work. James thanked her and watched as she walked toward the elevators. The rest of the afternoon went smoothly. James continued assisting guests, and even when things got busy, he remained focused. He was proving himself, not just to others, but to himself as well. Later that evening, as he was finishing his shift, Mr. Langston walked by. He stopped for a moment and said, Good work today, James. I've been hearing good things about you. James smiled. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. As Mr. Langston walked away, James felt a sense of pride. He had come a long way since that morning. He had faced challenges, but he hadn't let them break him. And tomorrow was another day. A chance to continue proving that he truly belonged here. The sun had set, and the Grand Horizon Hotel was now glowing with warm lights. The lobby remained busy, with guests arriving from late flights and others returning from city tours. James was still at the reception desk, finishing up his shift. Even after a long day, he felt good. He had handled his work well, dealt with difficult guests calmly, and was earning the trust of his colleagues. The uncomfortable moment from the morning, the time he was stopped at the entrance, felt like a distant memory now. As he was organizing some paperwork, Linda walked over with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one in front of him and smiled. Here, you deserve it. James grinned. Thanks, Linda. You're a lifesaver. She leaned against the desk and took a sip of her coffee. I've been at this hotel for years, and I've seen all kinds of new employees. Some struggle, some take time to adjust. But you fit right in. James appreciated her words. That means a lot. I just want to do my best. Linda nodded. And you are. Before James could say anything else, a sudden noise caught their attention. A loud voice echoed across the lobby. I demand to speak to the manager right now. James turned to see Mr. Caldwell, the impatient guest from earlier, standing near the concierge desk. He was speaking angrily to a bellboy, waving his hands in frustration. The young bellboy, no older than 20, looked nervous. Mr. Langston, the general manager, was already approaching the scene. James and Linda exchanged glances before following him to see what was going on. What seems to be the problem, Mr. Caldwell? Mr. Langston asked, keeping his voice calm. Mr. Caldwell turned sharply. The problem is that this hotel is completely unprofessional. I booked the presidential suite, and I expect everything to be perfect. But my luggage was sent to the wrong room. I had to wait 15 minutes for it to be delivered properly. 15 minutes. Do you know how unacceptable that is? The bellboy quickly spoke up. Sir, I apologize for the delay. There was a mix-up with the room numbers, but we corrected it as soon as possible. Mr. Caldwell wasn't satisfied. That's not good enough. I should be compensated for this inconvenience. Mr. Langston remained professional. Mr. Caldwell, I understand your frustration, and I apologize for the mistake. However, the issue was resolved, and we will ensure it doesn't happen again. But Caldwell wasn't done. He crossed his arms and scoffed. This hotel clearly needs better staff. First, I had to deal with an inexperienced receptionist. And now this. His eyes shifted to James, and his expression turned smug. In fact, I don't understand how you hire people like him. The moment he said that, the lobby grew quiet. The way he said, people like him, made it clear that he wasn't just talking about inexperience. James felt his chest tighten. He had dealt with rude guests before, but this was different. Before James could respond, Mr. Langston stepped forward, his tone firm. "Mr. Caldwell, I will not tolerate disrespect toward my staff. James is a skilled receptionist, and every employee here is trained to provide excellent service. If you are unhappy with your stay, we will gladly assist you in finding accommodations elsewhere." Mr. Caldwell's face turned red with embarrassment. He hadn't expected the general manager to stand up for his staff so openly. After a long pause, he muttered, "That won't be necessary," then turned and stormed off toward the elevators. The staff and a few guests who had witnessed the scene exchanged glances. Some even nodded in approval. Mr. Langston turned to James. "Are you all right?" James nodded. "Yeah. I appreciate that, sir." Mr. Langston gave a small smile. "You're part of this team, James. I take care of my team." As the tension in the lobby faded, Linda patted James on the back. "Well, that was something." James let out a small laugh. "Yeah, but you know what? I'm glad I'm here." Linda grinned. "Good, because this place needs people like you." James felt a deep sense of belonging. He had faced challenges, but he had also found support. He wasn't just another employee. He was part of something bigger. And no matter what came next, he knew he was ready. The next morning, James arrived at the hotel feeling more confident than ever. His journey here had started with a rough beginning, but he had proven himself. He wasn't just a new employee anymore. He was part of the Grand Horizon Hotel family. As he stepped inside, he noticed that the staff greeted him warmly. The bellboys nodded, the housekeeping staff smiled, and even some of the guests recognized him from the previous day. The change was subtle, but it was real. James walked over to the front desk, where Linda was already checking out a guest. She glanced at him and grinned. "Morning, James. Ready for another day?" James smiled back. "Always." He placed his things behind the desk and checked the schedule for the day. A few VIP guests were expected to arrive, along with a corporate group for a business conference. It was going to be a busy shift, but he was ready. Just as he was reviewing room availability, Mr. Langston walked by. He paused at the desk and looked at James. "James, do you have a moment?" James straightened up. "Of course, sir." Mr. Langston gestured for him to follow. They walked through the lobby and into a small office near the back. Mr. Langston sat down at his desk and motioned for James to sit as well. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Mr. Langston said, folding his hands together. "You've only been here for a short time, but you've already made an impression. You're hardworking, professional, and you handle difficult situations with grace." James felt a sense of pride but remained humble. "Thank you, sir. I'm just doing my job." Mr. Langston nodded. "And you're doing it well. That's why I'd like to offer you an opportunity. We have an open position for a junior supervisor at the front desk. It's a step up from receptionist. More responsibility, better pay, and the chance to lead a team." James blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected this. A junior supervisor. Mr. Langston smiled. "Yes, you've proven that you can handle the job, and I believe you'd be a great fit for the role. Think about it. You don't have to decide right away." James took a deep breath. Just a few days ago, he had been kicked out of the hotel before even starting his job. And now he was being offered a promotion. "I don't need time to think, sir," James said with a confident smile. "I'd be honored to take the position." Mr. Langston stood up and extended his hand. "Then congratulations, James. Welcome to the leadership team." James shook his hand, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. When he walked back to the front desk, Linda raised an eyebrow. What was that about? James grinned. I just got promoted. Linda's eyes widened. Are you serious? That's amazing. The other staff members nearby overheard and started congratulating him. It was a moment of pure joy, a reminder that hard work and perseverance always paid off. As James continued his shift, he felt different, not because of the title, but because of what it represented. He had faced challenges, but he had stayed true to himself. He had earned his place here. Later that evening, as he walked out of the hotel after his shift, he looked up at the glowing sign, Grand Horizon Hotel. This place had once been unfamiliar to him, but now it felt like home. And this was just the beginning of an even bigger journey.